A second excellent debate took place in Oxford, England, November 2012, at the Oxford Union, the world's most prestigious debating society. People who have spoken there include the Dalai Lama, Malcolm X, Salman Rushdie, Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein. The proposition was, this house believes in God. For the believers were three Christians, John Lennox, Joanna Collicott, and Peter Hitchens. For the atheists, Dan Barker, Michael Shermer, and Peter Milliken. John Lennox, an Oxford professor of math and philosophy, goes first.
But people are now so desperate to show that the universe created itself from nothing, which seems to me to be an immediate oxymoron. If I say X created Y, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. If I say X created X, I'm assuming the existence of X to explain the existence of X, which simply shows that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists utter it.
I agree with Lennox that to say X created X, that the universe created itself, doesn't make good sense.
And here we reach what for me is the chief evidence, not only for the existence but the nature of God. It is Jesus Christ. He it was who not only taught the golden rule but embodied it, fed the hungry, healed the sick and suffering, and welcomed society's outcasts, brought honour and respect to the marginalised and ashamed. And he's brought forgiveness and peace to multi-millions around the world. He's able to do this, of course, because though he was a man, he uniquely never was only a man, but God become human. The central evidence for this startling claim is, of course, his historical resurrection from the dead that launched Christianity in the world. This is, of course, ladies and gentlemen, a crunch issue. If Jesus rose from the dead, death is not the end and atheism is false. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity is false. And I remember at Cambridge as a student listening to the brilliant Sir Norman Anderson, a legal expert, going through forensically the evidence from his legal perspective as a brilliant lawyer. And he said at the end of it, the empty tomb then of Jesus forms a veritable rock on which all rationalistic theories of the resurrection dash themselves in vain.
I would like to point out that this Anderson guy may have been a brilliant legal expert, but he was also a Christian missionary, which makes his objectivity somewhat suspect. Also, the resurrection accounts are not consistent, as Dan Barker will point out.
And so I don't simply believe there is a God. I've come to know him and trust him. And I have strong reasons for doing so, because of Christ dying and rising again for me. And that has generated in me a sense of utterly unmerited forgiveness, acceptance and peace. That has enabled me to face the ugly side of my own nature, and with God's help to do something about it. But it's enabled me to face something else. The hardest problem I face as a Christian is the problem of evil and pain. My niece getting a tumour at 22 that kills her. What do I say to my sister? And this is the hardest problem we face. But it seems to me that atheism here has no answer. Because by definition, atheism believes that human death is the end. So there is no ultimate hope. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, we could stay here till midnight and beyond arguing, as has been done in this university for centuries, what a good God should, might, would, could, if not, possibly might, just could he not have done, and we'll get nowhere. So it seems to me there's another question we can ask, and it's this. Granted that life presents us with a double picture, we see some beautiful things. We see some ragged edges. We see hurt and pain, and we see joy. How can we come to terms with that? And it seems to me here is no simplistic answer, but a window into an answer, and it's this. If it is actually true that Jesus is, as I believe him to be, the Son of God, then we can ask the question, what is God doing on a cross? And the answer comes back at the very least. God has not remained distant from our human suffering, but has become part of it. And the other side of that is this: because Jesus rose from the dead, he is going to be the ultimate judge. Now here's an irony, because atheism has no ultimate hope of justice by definition. The vast majority of people in the history of the world have died without justice and will die without justice. And if death is the end, then of course they have no hope of ultimate justice. But the promise in the New Testament, guaranteed by the resurrection of Jesus, is that he is to be the judge in the coming day. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the reasons why I believe that God is real and worthy to be trusted. Thank you.
I think it's true that without God there is no ultimate justice. But wishing for a caring God is not per se a good argument for the actual existence of such a God. And it is true that atheists have no philosophical answer to the problem of evil, but they don't have to have an answer because they don't posit a good God in the first place. Rather, their position is that evil is part of reality, and they will do what they can to mitigate that evil. I think Lennox badly mischaracterizes atheists as not wanting ultimate justice. Of course atheists want ultimate justice. They're just saying that ultimate justice is not a metaphysical reality in this life or in a theoretical afterlife. Next is Dan Barker, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Dan is a former minister, now an atheist.
I won't tell you my whole story, but I went through a process of deconversion that took 4 or 5 years, starting as a firm believer, evangelical, street preacher. In the foreword to my book, Godless, it tells that story. Richard Dawkins writes, Dan Barker was not just a preacher, he's the kind of preacher you would not want to sit next to on a bus. That was me. I was so convinced. I was so in love with Jesus, my Savior and my Lord. But I went through a process. Evangelical, fundamentalist, where I migrated into more of a moderate, where I preached less hell and more love, into more of a more liberal stage in my life, until eventually I dumped out all the bathwater and I found out there's no baby there.
Dan goes on to ask what day of the week it is. Thursday. The day is named after the Norse god Thor, Thor's Day. But Thor is now on the scrap heap of history, and to Dan, likewise, so is the God of the Bible. Dan says we humans are very good at inventing myths, stories, metaphors, which can be beautiful, which can give purpose, can give hope, but are nonetheless fictions. And to Dan, the God character within those stories is likewise a fiction.
The reason I am a non-believer today is because of the lack of evidence and argument for a deity. If there were any real evidence for a God, then by now someone should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing that out. Any scientist in the world would jump at the chance to say, here we go. I mean, if there is a hitherto unknown force of the cosmos that we haven't yet been able to determine, what scientist in the world would not love to make that point? That hasn't been done yet. And you were very eloquent in saying that you have a belief in a God, that what you believe is God. But belief is not knowledge. Belief is simply an assertion, according to the Bible, that you believers believe. Belief is the evidence of things not seen, the substance of things hoped for.
I'm very familiar with that passage in the Bible that Dan referred to, because it's a classic example of religious double talk posing as insight. Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. No, it isn't. Faith isn't evidence. Faith is faith. It isn't evidence. Is my faith in Santa Claus evidence that he exists? No, it's just an indication of my particular belief, not evidence that Santa Claus actually exists.
Belief is not evidence. Anytime you have to accept an assertion by faith, you're admitting that that assertion cannot be accepted on its own merits. It doesn't have the strength to be accepted as any other, perhaps, scientific hypothesis would be taken. Do scientists gather together every Sunday morning in their scientific sanctuaries and bow their heads and sing, "Yes, the Higgs boson is real. I know in my heart the Higgs boson is real. I will have faith. I will be strong to this secular world who challenges my belief that the God particle is real. Amen." If they did such a thing, you would think they were pretty insecure on the concept, wouldn't you? That's what we find with faith, a constant puffing yourself up. Be strong, resist the world, believe in these absurdities in spite of the doubts. The resurrection of Jesus Christ, the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, is the absolute worst example anyone could possibly give for the reliability of the Bible. And I'm not exaggerating. Let me tell you why I'm not exaggerating. Many stories in the Bible are given once or twice. The resurrection story is given 5 times. You can compare them. Scholars have never been able to reconcile those contradictory accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. And besides that, and there are many of them, was the tomb open or closed when the women arrived? What message did the angels give? How many angels were at the tomb? And so on. Besides that, we see through the development in the first century of the Christian myth that the earliest stories were simple. There were no angels. There were very few remarkable events. But as you go 10, 20, 30 years later, you find more and more until you get to the book of John, where you find these outlandish stories. What you see in the development of the resurrection story in the New Testament is the development of a legend. Starting simple, growing over time, getting more and more fantastic. It's a mistake to treat those accounts as if they were flat, as if they all happened at one time. We can see before our eyes the development from a simple, unvarnished, perhaps some element of truth in some story about someone who may have spiritually ascended, like we say Grandma died and went to heaven. Maybe the early apostles said Jesus died and went to heaven, but that exaggerated. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not evidence for a God. And even then, it would just be evidence that a man rose from the dead. How do you connect the dots? The whole idea that in some of these teleological arguments that complexity requires a designer, and Richard, somewhere here, pointed out in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, anything that is complex enough to design functional complexity, any deity who could design has to have a mind that is at least as functionally complex as the thing that it designed, right? If your premise is that functional complexity requires a designer, if that's your premise, then the mind of that deity also must, by that premise, require a designer. And you get into this infinite regress of, well, then God needed a bigger God and a bigger God. I think most scientists prefer to just stop with what we do know rather than speculate endlessly about a mountain of turtles. Another lack that takes against the evidence for existence of a God is a lack of agreement among believers. If there is a deity that you love and care about, why do no two believers agree on any social or moral issue? You name it. Gay marriage, doctor-assisted suicide, stem cell research, death, the war, you name these social issues we're struggling with. You find devout, praying, Bible-believing Christians on both sides of those issues. Paul wrote in the Bible, God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than that Bible? They don't agree. Why not? Why shouldn't it be clear? Why shouldn't this all-loving, all-caring deity make it clear to us? It is not. They have fought with each other over these issues. The 30 Years' War, which was based to some degree on the confessional differences over infant baptism and transubstantiation. People were killed. John Calvin had his friend Servetus killed over a simple misplacement of a preposition. The lack of agreement among believers is a serious problem towards the existence of an all-loving, all-caring God. And then, of course, the problem of evil. And our previous speaker pointed out that is probably the Achilles heel in theology. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there's no God. At least no good God. Maybe there's an evil God. Those children are dying at the same random rate, even though their parents are desperately praying, desperately loving those kids, wanting some kind of divine intervention. And yet, as Ann Gaylor says, who's the former president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, nothing fails like prayer. That would be evidence. If you could give some scientific evidence that prayer actually makes an organic difference, not just makes you feel better, but an actual difference in the real world, that would be something to put on the table. The fact that that's not put on the table shows that prayer is pretty much talking to yourself. Finally, there's no need for a belief in God. Millions, tens of millions of people on this planet live happy lives, productive lives, moral lives, purposeful lives, lives of hope and meaning, without deluding ourselves that there are these invisible personalities populating some supernatural realm. We are quite happy, thank you, without that belief. Based on all of that, it is more likely to reject the proposition than to accept it. Thank you.
Next is Joanna Collicott, a psychology of religion professor. I thought her remarks did not advance the debate at all. Throughout, she talked vaguely about how one should relate to God, rather than presenting reasons to believe in a God.
In my case, I was driven to wonder if God was at one and the same time more cosmic in scale and more relationally intimate than I had previously imagined. I started to get an inkling that the meaningful question to ask might not be, do I believe in God, but does God believe in me?
She ended in a similar vein, talking about how to relate to God, and the story of doubting Thomas in the Bible, how Thomas was a reasonable skeptic, but then when he put his finger into Jesus' wounds, he was profoundly transformed into a believer, calling Jesus my Lord and my God. I guess her point was that religion is not a merely intellectual assent, but a full commitment of the spirit. Well, maybe so, but that's not an argument for the existence of God. A folklorish miracle story by religious propagandists is not a good argument for God. Now, this woman co-authored a book with her husband, Alistair McGrath, called The Dawkins Delusion, which is a refutation of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And McGrath quotes Dawkins as referring to the Old Testament God as a petty, unjust, capriciously malevolent bully. And McGrath says that, he doesn't believe in such a God and doesn't personally know anyone who does. But that is exactly the kind of God depicted in the Old Testament. McGrath is just ignoring what's there. Standard operating procedure for liberal Christians is to ignore whatever they want. Usually by saying they believe in the person of Jesus, not the Bible or the Old Testament God.
Nowadays, I describe myself as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. These words are carefully chosen, for my faith is Christocentric rather than theocentric.
She conveniently ignores the fact that Jesus himself fully believed in the Old Testament God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's move on. Miklos Shermer speaks next. Shermer lays out a Darwinian origin of religion. When early humans heard a rustle in the grass, they could ignore it as just the wind, or they could decide it might be a dangerous predator and run. Now, if they ran and it turns out it was just the wind, no problem. But if they didn't run and it was in fact a predator, that human would be lunch for the predator. So it was wise and practical to err on the side of caution. Thus, humans developed the propensity to assume there is some intentional agency behind everything that happens, in order to play it safe and survive.
We also infuse into those patterns intentional agency. We just think everything is not just real, but real and animated, alive, even if it's invisible. We now have a lot of evidence from cognitive psychology that this begins at a very early age, perhaps as early as age 2 or 3. I'll just give you one experiment among many.
Shermer describes an experiment where little children were supposed to throw Velcro balls at a target, but turned around backwards, so it was hard to do. The experimenter leaves the room telling the kids to just do the best you can and then tell me how you did. and the kids proceed to cheat and just walk up to the target and stick the ball on. Second part of the experiment, same thing, except the kids were told Princess Anne, an invisible princess, was sitting in the chair right there, and she can see everything you're doing. The experimenter leaves the room. The kids stop cheating.
The shadow of enforcement, the sort of infusion of agency of an invisible being in a chair that sees what we do, keeps track of our moral behavior, begins at a very early age. Our brains have evolved this capacity for agency. That's the earliest God beliefs.
Shermer asks, of the thousands of religions, of the thousands of denominations of Christianity alone, how likely is it that one of these has it right and all the rest are wrong? Isn't it more likely that they are all socially constructed, sharing common themes?
Or is it more likely that all of these religion and God beliefs are socially constructed, psychologically constructed, and that none of them are right in any reality sense, in the ontological sense? They're all constructed this way. To an anthropologist from Mars, these are all indistinguishable. Of course, they're individually different, but taking the big picture, they're all indistinguishable in that sense. Flood myths, not original to you. Virgin birth myths, not original to you. Resurrection myths, not original to you. Shortly after the crucifixion of Jesus, there arose another Messiah, Apollonius of Asia Minor, whose followers claimed he was the Son of God, that he was able to walk through closed doors, heal the sick, cast out demons, and raise a dead girl back to life. He was accused of witchcraft, sent to Rome before the court, was jailed, but escaped. After he died, his followers claimed he appeared to them and ascended into heaven. This redemption after being oppressed is a very common myth throughout history. And you can understand the psychology behind it. The Native Americans in 1890 began a Messiah myth with a Paiute Indian, Wavoka, who received visions of God. He was thought to be the Messiah or the deliverer of the Messiah, in which the buffalo would all return, the white man would leave and go back to Europe, and life would become better again. This is what oppressed peoples do. They make up stories that makes them feel better. It's often claimed that you can't prove a negative. Us atheists, we can't prove there is no God. Okay, I can prove that humans created gods and religions, and I just did. And there's 50 more stories like this of the geographical location, the time you happen to have been born, the anthropology of religion, the psychology of religion, the sociology of religion. We know exactly how this happens now, all the way down to the neurology, the neuroscience of religion. We know that people are making this up. Now, of course, you can make the argument, well, God planted the God module in the brain so he could talk to us or something. How come we all seem to talk to different gods then? Are there just a bunch of them out there and they're competing for our brains? Why is it, as Dan Barker pointed out, there's very little agreement amongst believers? Why is that? So my conclusion then is that, as you think about the House vote tonight, again, what's more likely? It's obvious that all these other gods are made up. You already know that. You agree with me on that. You're all atheists for all those other gods. So I would just implore you to go one God further. Thank you.
I agree that the plethora of differing religions does suggest that none of them are true. But you could also see it, as I do, that all these religions are flawed attempts to arrive at an underlying truth, a possible real God. I do think we need to dump all these primitive gods and all the gods of the major religions, which gods, if you're honest, I think are also primitive. But I personally feel I've arrived at a credible version of God, and that's the one last God that I'm not willing to give up. Next is Peter Hitchens, a journalist and author, the brother of the late Christopher Hitchens. Peter, unlike his famously atheist brother, is a Christian.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I hate this argument. In fact, I loathe taking part in it almost more than any other argument I ever take part in.
For why?
because I have to come up here and defend the religion of love, brotherhood, peace, justice, and turning the other cheek rather than kicking the other guy in the crotch. And I have to listen. I have to listen while I'm doing it to these gentlemen, who remind me constantly of the most irritating, infuriating, revolting person I ever knew, namely my adolescent self. Honestly. I mean, haven't we all heard it all before? Horus, Mithras, they're all the same. No, they're not all the same. They all disagree with each other. They must be wrong. They can't all be right. This is the stuff of sixth form debate. There has been nothing serious said against the concept of God by the opposition this evening at all.
Hitchens goes on to read a passage in the Bible where God directly castigates Job for asking questions of God, when Job knows so little compared to Almighty God. Hitchens' point was that we puny humans know nothing compared to God, and we can't pin the existence of God down, so that the real question to focus on is not the existence of God, but why do people choose to believe or not believe?
What we are discussing here is a matter of opinion. And a matter of opinion, Mr. President, is a matter of choice. And the real question before us is why we choose what we choose. And this is the most fascinating part of the argument. Why is it, ladies and gentlemen, they so much want there not to be a God? Why would you want there not to be a God? Why would you want to live in a purposeless chaos in which none of your actions had any significance, in which there was no hope of justice, in which the lives of all those whom you loved ended abruptly at death and had no further significance? Why would you want, desire, actively wish to live in a universe as disgusting as that? You'd have to have a very good reason. And I think these gentlemen do have a very good reason, and it's what they never ever wish to discuss. They don't want justice. They do want the dead to be dead. They do want the universe to be purposeless. They do not want their own individual actions to have any other significance than their immediate effect. You will have to discuss with them why they should be so keen on that proposition. God is the principal opposition in our society to lawless, ruthless power. To the bully, to the autocrat, to the despot, to the criminal, to the person who treats his neighbours like dirt. Fundamentally, once we have dispensed with that concept in our society, we are left with nothing. Now, the atheists don't wish to discuss this because they know exactly what I'm saying. They're very well aware of the implications of what I'm saying for society in general. They know perfectly well that if everybody didn't believe in God, the comfortable lives they live in extremely agreeable suburbs, where they can trust people not to cheat them and rob them and mug them and rape them, would come to an end. They want to keep the secret to themselves. They want to have all the joys, not just now, all the joys and all the advantages provided by Christianity, but not pay the dues. And that is why, when you challenge the atheist side on this very point, they run from it, refusing to discuss it. That is why nobody ever answers Thomas Nagel's question. Why is it that they so much want there not to be a God? Well, I'll tell you exactly why. It's for precisely the same reasons as I very much want there to be one. Vote for the motion, please.
I thought Hitchens was awful. He dismissed good arguments from the atheist side just by way of contemptuous attitude. He focused on whether people want or don't want God rather than objective reasons for or against God's existence. And most egregiously, he cast the worst of atheists as representative, as though all atheists are at base selfish nihilists. Sure, there are some atheists who want no God so that they can feel free to behave in evil ways, but that's a small percentage. All the atheists I know are humanists who work hard and unselfishly towards the betterment of humanity. An honest debater takes the best of the opposition as representative, not the worst. And to imply that his specific opponents this day are in reality evil connivers says more about where he is coming from than where they are coming from. I never particularly liked his brother either, same sort of acerbic personality. Last for the atheist side is Peter Milliken, a philosophy professor at Hertford College, which is a part of Oxford University.
Now, Peter Hitchens suggests that it's a matter of choice. I beg to differ. Most of us wish to form our beliefs on the basis of the evidence for our beliefs to be true. I once struggled enormously with this question, desperately hoping that I would find good reasons to believe in God. Sadly, in the end, I had to give it up, not because I wanted to, but because that's where the evidence pointed. In short, all solid experimental evidence and all plausible scientific theory points to the brain as the basis of thought and shows the brain acting only through causal intermediaries, sending signals through the nerves and so forth. Yet the theistic hypothesis, the claim that there's this immaterial God, claims not only that our thinking self can continue without our physical brains in the supposed afterlife, but also that this supposed immaterial self is made in the image of an infinite immaterial self, which not only is independent of matter, but somehow capable of acting on matter instantaneously, anywhere, doing anything it wishes, and just by the power of thought. This is an extraordinary claim, and surely requires extraordinary evidence to make it remotely plausible. The idea that a mind might exist in that way is just complete speculation.
I agree, it is speculation. It is theorizing. It is not science. But unlike Milliken, I don't assume science is the ultimate arbiter of reality. Milliken goes on to say that in order to survive, humans needed to cooperate. So it's not surprising we are universally moral beings. Morality does not need to be based on religion. In fact, religion often horribly distorts morality, as in the Inquisition.
Peter Hitchens says, why would you want this? Why would you want a world in which you don't have ultimate accountability and justice? Well, I'd love there to be, but I'm sorry, there isn't going to be. And I don't think it's possible. Suppose you have a baby that dies in agony, only a few months after its birth, from some disease that we can do nothing about. Tell me, can anything that happens in some afterlife remedy that or make it right? No, it can't. And the idea that God is calculating things in such a way that this baby's suffering is weighed on the balance as something that can be compensated is pretty disgusting. But even if it's possible, it's wishful thinking. Suppose you go to a restaurant and you're going to have a 4-course dinner and you have the starter and it's absolutely disgusting. What is the rational view to take about what the rest of the courses are going to be like? Well, probably they're going to be disgusting too, right? You don't say, oh, well, that was really awful, but the next course must be fantastic to make up for it.
Bertrand Russell said something similar. If you find a crate of oranges with its top layer rotten, it's just wishful thinking to assume the rest are not also rotten. But analogies don't necessarily equal logical proofs or disproofs. Analogies are more a means of illustrating your perspective. You can pick the analogy to fit your argument. For example, you could expand the orange crate analogy to a room full of orange crates, where some crates are rotten, but others are fine. Or you could interpret a rotten orange not as evidence that other oranges must also be rotten, but as evidence that fresh, juicy oranges exist somewhere. Maybe not in this crate or room, but somewhere.
God is able to make up the rules. On the theist hypothesis, he doesn't have to work within the constraints of a pre-existing theory. He can design the universe however he likes. Why would a God who can do that, who can create life just like that, as Genesis says he did, why would such a God go through 13.7 billion years to create one species capable of relationship with him? Or the Milky Way's got 200 billion stars, and it's one of 125 billion galaxies. But even if there were an Earth-like star, an Earth-like planet, inhabitable planet, for every single star, the vast majority of the universe would still be totally inhospitable to life. A comparison's been drawn between a volume of 6 million Olympic swimming pools capable of containing 1 molecule of water, and then claiming that that is finely tuned for the storage of water.
Certainly, if any of us were God, we would have created a more efficient universe without all this extra space and extra time and extra suffering. We certainly would not have done such an ostensibly poor job. But maybe the extra time and space is no big deal to an omnipotent God. And maybe the extra suffering can be compensated for by a blissful afterlife. Maybe God operates at a wholly different level than we humans do. I think atheists make a key mistake here in expecting God to act as we humans would act. They tend to see God in anthropomorphic terms, as though God were a super powerful human being who has to go by our rules and our logic. They tend to see God as subject to our logic, subject to nature, subject to the laws of science, subject to the law of cause and effect. But that would not be God. That would be some power less than God. If a God exists, he created those things, logic and nature and cause and effect, so he is not ultimately subject to them. I think if you're going to consider the possibility of a supreme being existing, you shouldn't postulate a less than supreme being and base your conclusions on that definition. Despite good points on the atheist side, the final piece of logic that atheism requires, that the universe is simply here with no ultimate meaning behind it, does not compute for me. For me, God, a theoretical, unverifiable, inscrutable God, still makes more sense than no God. So that was the debate. I think officially the atheist side won by a vote of 168 to 143. Let me finish with Richard Dawkins. Some people think Dawkins is too harsh on religion. I don't. I think he's right on the money when he talks about how religion is too often profoundly harmful. Dawkins, who was in the audience that day, had a face-to-face discussion with Alistair McGrath, the guy that wrote the Dawkins Delusion. Here's McGrath.
In your writings, we have what we might call a double critique of religion. There is a sort of intellectual critique. In your view, the religions do not have adequate evidential foundations. But alongside that, I occasionally detect flashes of anger, that this is something that is bad, that is evil. The world would be a better place if things were to change. And so I suppose my question really is this: why the anger? What is it that really makes you cross about the way religious people think or behave?
I think two possible answers to that. One would be relating to the evidential point. First, I think that religion teaches people to stop questioning. I'm sure you disagree with that, but the way I see it, we have the privilege of being in this universe for a few decades. And during that time, it is an enormous privilege to be able to understand something about the universe in which we live, why we're here, why we were ever born, where we come from. And I think that is such a wonderful thing to be able to do, that I am hostile, I can get angry about competing accounts which seem to me to not encourage that kind of questioning, but instead to say, this is how it is, it's all written in the Holy Book, it was written 2,000 years ago, and that's the end of it. I think that deprives people. I think that is such a belittling, a demeaning view of the universe, and I think it's tragic that children are brought up with that when they could be brought up in a more open-minded way. So that's one reason for the anger. The other reason we've touched upon, it is that I do think that faith, unsupported by evidence, is a lethal weapon. Doesn't have to be, of course it doesn't have to be, but it can be. It's a weapon because possibly unscrupulous people can get hold of often young men and use them as weapons, use them as human bombs. And the only reason they can be deployed as human bombs is that they have been brought up from childhood onwards to believe implicitly, without question, that whatever the particular religion is, the details don't matter. The point is that they do believe that it is the will of God that they should detonate themselves and blow up a busload of people or blow up a skyscraper in New York. I don't think that any kind of reasoned argument would do that to people. And so I believe that religious faith, is an enormously powerful psychological weapon. It isn't always used for the bad, of course, but the fact that it can be used for the bad makes me want to cut it off at the roots, and at very least to stop the inculcation into children of the idea that there is something virtuous in faith.
I am a theist, but I agree with Dawkins. Faith without questioning, faith in the religion you were born into, faith in faith, is not a virtue. As a former Christian myself, I think the right thing to do is to reject Christianity as a valid belief system, just keep its good ideas, and then decide for yourself if the existence of a broader concept of God makes sense to you or not.